Thank you again so much. I'm so glad to be home. It really grounds me in a lot of ways. I'm living in Chicago for the past 10 years. So people are making fun of me because I wrote notes, and I am going to read from my notes because otherwise I have nothing to say. Okay, so let's see. I'm in African American Studies at Northwestern University in the Midwest, and the kinds of conversations that are happening there are so different in a lot of ways than the kinds of conversations that are happening here, particularly as they're sort of expressed this week. And I really want more cross-fertilization between the kinds of discourses that are happening in U.S. ethnic studies and what's happening in ethnic studies and Hawaiian studies, Pacific Islander studies here in the Pacific. And what emerges for me as what is incredibly productive and empowering and important that emerges from this conference of what's happening at ethnic studies at UH and Hawaiian studies is the deeply local, the sort of real attention to the deeply local and the grounded, and not just the abstract and the theoretical. Also, of course, and you know all this, the attentiveness to land and also the ocean and skies, the use of multilingual sources, I think is really critical. The dialogic relationship that doesn't seem to just be tense or non-existent between Hawaiian studies and ethnic studies. The respect, rigorous engagement with community, which we talk about a lot in U.S. ethnic studies on the continent, but I don't often see, even at UC Berkeley and one of the founding places of ethnic studies. And also what is a real strength here, I think, is the always thinking of politics, of theory and politics, praxis and politics, and the attentiveness to Kanaka Maoli rights and the futures. So one of the themes that I see, or the key words that I see as emerging from this week is expansive. And thinking about oceans as expansive and unfixed, and thinking about what are the meeting points beyond the Pacific, right? And how bodies of water meet, and what are those other sort of nexus points. So I'm just going to pose a few questions, and I'm wondering, and these are not contentious questions, they're just questions that arise. So I'm wondering if we can afford in ethnic studies here, thinking about futures, to dream bigger and more creatively, even more radically beyond the terms and categories that we're given, right? How can we imagine alternative futures that really aren't based on the categories that we're given? And I think it's important that we remain undisciplined, as ethnic studies is, and I mean both disciplinary boundaries like anthropology and political science, and also undisciplined, unruly peoples within and outside the academy. And how can ethnic studies be located everywhere? I think some really compelling new directions would be small island studies, and these are all things that other panelists and other folks have been talking about. Comparative work or relational work with the Caribbean, I think could be incredibly productive, and I'm sure people are doing that. So, while Vince just talked about the specificity and the locality, the localism, right? The importance of the deeply local and the site specificity of what's happening here. Selfishly, I want to make what's happening here more expansive and available to people who are not in the Pacific. So how can people who are my colleagues really take insights from the kinds of discussions that are happening here? And I think that part of that is how do we work toward a more expansive politics and visions for the future? The other kinds of questions that I think were raised over the course of the last 3 days are the questions of pulling apart and seeing the intersections of indigeneity, race, culture, ethnicity, and the question also of class, gender, and sexuality, which I think still remain under-theorized, and also of environmental practices and community engagement. So 2 main questions I have. One is the question of who. Who should future coalition solidarities and the building of a global movement include? Who does that include when we say we need to build a global movement, or when people who are speaking here say that? And then the question is what? What are we working towards, right? I'm talking about the shared futures. So in building a global movement, I'm imagining that this would be a movement that brings down or offers a very serious critique of capitalism, which is married to racism, colonialism, sexism, as we know. And so the question is who? Does the shared vision stop at indigenous peoples? So from panel 1, I recall a panelist speaking about having a global movement of indigenous peoples. And well, again, what I'm stating here is a question not to be argumentative, but to think about expansivity, expansiveness. So what about a broader coalition, right? So if the ideas for political futures of Hawaii are land-based and based on indigeneity, what does that mean for forming coalitions with people whose relationship to land is severed? Something about African Americans specifically, but also other formerly colonized people outside of the Pacific, right? What are the strengths and the limits of position-based, identity-based, and experience-based politics? So basically, I'm asking, how can we develop a more expansive politics? And I think that positionality, locatedness, land, identity are parts of this. And what about when we reorient that as well, though, to think about things that are not as rooted or as grounded, but that are shared political visions that exist. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there and mention one last thing that I think was raised from Mike Perez on our panel on indigenizing ethnic studies. I would love to raise the question, how do we institutionalize diversity is what he asked, and indigeneity in the academic context. How do we do things like raise consciousness, connect with community, prepare future leaders, and develop what I'm saying is the central point of future expansive politics that is attentive to all of the space and place specific dynamics, while really I'm trying to think about a global solidarity of people who are formerly oppressed and who are basically down with the cause in a global critique of capitalism that will then, address questions of racism and other forms of oppression.